So this is the third installment of the series I'm making. And the second sephira, CHOKMAH, meaning wisdom. Now this is always one of the most ambiguous words there exist, wisdom, and it pertains to the innocence that I was discussing in Keter. But the innocence which is not conditioned by any judgment or any prior judgment. Innocence, essentially, it does judge, but only in the moment as it truthfully experiences what an impulse or a situation has as an effect. So the judgment is like one would judge an absence of oxygen, in a sense, by choking. That's, in a very basic sense, a value judgment of the environment. It's a very bad environment because it has no oxygen. In this sense, innocence will judge, and in this sense of necessity, it will lead to its first specific path of choices, which would be called wisdom. So, wisdom is the initiation of a path of choices that eventually leads to the manifestation of one's unborn potential, which is represented by Keter. So Keter is essentially the kind of the empty, I would say the empty placeholder, or the sort of universal beginning that has no specific qualities but is able to take on quality, and because of its specific nature, because of its being somewhere and somewhen. And CHOKMAH is then the first impulse that actually goes about doing this. And in a very real way, this must come to contradict a lot of what the point in Keter stood for. It must separate itself, let's say, from the unity that Keter still truly experiences, and basically swap that for power. So the step from Keter, which might be seen as some kind of exalted, like Christ center, as people might see it, along with every other point on the central axis of mildness. It might all be seen as a Christ centers, or Apollonian, or even Buddhistic. But anyway, so the first step away from that pillar to the right side, the side of mercy, and the side of strength, of force, not of strength, of force, is the translation of the potential into an action. And because an action is, is itself a resistance. An action is, as I explained in another video, there's no fundamental difference between conducting and resisting, because you cannot conduct without having a very slight level of resistance. Like, let's say the metaphorical word, the ether, is basically just a word for hypothetical resistance that is required to conduct, that the mind requires to understand how things like, for example, light can be conducted. It's unthinkable it's hard to think anything propagating without a medium, and a medium is a form of resistance. It's a bit paradoxical, because normally you would think that a medium is takes away resistance, but let's say the television medium takes away the absolute resistance of there being no television medium, and utilizes the very mild resistance of things like radio waves. So CHOKMAH would come to be from Keter at the moment Keter would open itself up to specific forces or things that come into its sphere, whereby it becomes partial. And then Chokmah is the partiality itself, the first partiality, where it is realized that in order to keep on existing, one must exert whatever one has. And this goes without any conscious intent. It's just the first motion coming into being, the first motion producing a chain of action, of action and reaction, a chain of events. And this wisdom that comes in the place of this innocence is a deeply self-absorbed wisdom. It's the type of wisdom that simply means staying with oneself, consistency, interpreting everything very strictly in terms of what's going to be the result, or basically the avoiding of running into things that are stronger than oneself. This is must be counted as a primordial wisdom, because without this wisdom, existence, manifestation would not be possible. But this first wisdom that comes from the innocence and the non-judgmental crown is in fact a deeply judgmental, fundamentally judgmental impulse of, one might say, quite tyrannical impulse. And this is the paradox of for example, how they say Jesus brought the sword of any kind of religion that claims mercy as its origin, or universality as its origin. Why its actions are always so relentlessly aggressive. That's once you have a conception of yourself as a wholly justified, or something that is not contradicted by any kind of judgment that matters, and then you sort of step out into the world, which is filled with judgments and things you must judge, because they come at you with all sorts of problems and everything, violences or lies or good things. But anyway, whatever comes into us in this real world, when we are not withdrawn into Piteron, some kind of mountain, or in a cave, commands judgment, demands judgment from us. And so this primordial wisdom is the willingness and capacity to answer to this demand, to actually judge, and do so fully. One might say judge innocently, judge completely in terms of what spontaneously emerges as a judgment from one's being, rather than having to relate a situation to abstractions of earlier situation that you've learned or been taught in church. So wisdom is quite cold and hard in this Chokmah, and Chokmah is the masculine arm of the supernal triad. It relates to the lightning, to the planet Uranus in astrological terms, to sudden actions, but also to penetrating insight, to insights that and visions that are so clear and so sharp that everything else melts away. Visions and insights that can command the human world, scientific brilliant discoveries, all these kind of monadic insights that integrate the linear and the non-linear, like relativity, for example. They call the experience of Chokmah the vision of God face to face, where it's also said that no one could survive this. But I would think that an insight attained by Albert Einstein in his youth about light and gravity, the insight of relativity, would be typically something that would require that kind of level of exaltation of consciousness, to be very close to that non-judgmental sort of Godhead, fountainhead. I would interpret relativity, the insight, as an insight of Chokmah. Also because it's very partial. Relativity is essentially the insight of partiality, that any kind of judgment about the universe must be partial. Relativity essentially demonstrates that there is no universal judgment possible. So relativity is the logic of partiality, essentially, which is the will to power. The will to power is the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, which does away with the notion that things, let's say, that they simply exist, and also does away with the notion that there has been an origin. So according to this, within this paradigm, existence has always existed, and but it's also doing this to itself. It's not a passive thing. It doesn't simply happen to itself. It enacts itself through being the will to power, meaning that it's not a homogenic thing. It's composed of all sorts of units, centers, all sorts of keters that develop into chokmahs that try to overcome each other in order to become themselves, develop into a world. And in trying to overcome each other, they weave into each other and inadvertently use each other as threads for their own basket that makes their world. So in this way, we, the people we struggle with, we make them our world. But the thing is, the more we succumb to the standards, let's say the chokhmah, the wisdoms of the other people, the more we let ourselves be rationally convinced, for example, or by force convinced that they have reason, less and less our own basket will be our own life. We might become simply inhabitants of another life, of someone else's life, which many people, anyone who's worked sort of a shitty day job knows what this feels like, but also anyone who suffered emotional manipulation, or anyone who's had to struggle with his nest, with his parents, and that's basically anyone. We all know what it means to be woven into another life, a little bit, in part. So the wisdom of Chokmah commands that we keep weaving our own basket and keep resisting those we encounter, those we love but have to struggle with our wisdom. This is essentially the only way we can give this primordial innocence, or perpetuate it and share it, by doing the exact seeming opposite, which is entirely to follow our own path. But it's only superficially seeming the opposite. Anyone who knows the bliss of following his own path knows that it relates precisely to the most innocent part of oneself. It's the part that releases cathartic joys and weeping and all that. Anytime you discover your own path, rediscover it from the basket of other people's lives, there's a cathartic, innocent joy, like almost like what an infant would feel if it's reunited with its mother. So that's the reward of the violent wisdom in Chokmah. Reunification down the line with oneself, where would be the circle. So Chokmah is the straight line, which in infinity, for mathematics, always turns into a circle. But Chokmah is not a property of infinity. Chokmah is a part. Chokmah does not refer to infinity, where Keter refers to infinity, emerged directly out of it, and has not yet contradicted it. Chokmah is essentially the separation of infinity, the part where infinity becomes finite and starts to work on becoming a whole, so a circle. But a finite circle, not the circle of the infinite line, but of a piece of line, essentially, of a Chokmah.